This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
We welcome you once again to our survey of world religions. Today we are on lesson number 15, which is entitled Zoroastrianism, Ethical Dualism. Zoroastrianism, Ethical Dualism. Now we have referred to the religion called Zoroastrianism as ethical dualism. What do we mean by that? Let's stop for just a moment and explain that, and it will help us to understand this very unusual world religion. By ethical, we mean that which has reference to a standard of conduct, that which deals with right and wrong. And by dualism, we are referring to two beings, two opposing beings, one good and one bad, such as there is in Zoroastrianism, as we shall see in our study. And so Zoroastrianism is a study of ethical dualism. That is, there are two very powerful supreme beings, one good and one evil, who are in competition with one another. Zoroastrianism is a dying religion today, but about 1,500 years ago, it was a major religion of the world. About 500 years before the coming of Christ, the Zoroastrian religion was the chief religion of the greatest empire of that day and time. I'm speaking of the Persian Empire. It was the major religion of the Persian Empire, which covered territory from Ethiopia in Africa, going through the Middle East and into the Far East. It included territory as far east as the land of India. In the book of Esther, remember Esther was a queen of Persia, a Jewish girl who became queen of Persia. In that book, the empire of Persia is described as having 127 provinces in it. Some of the greatest kings of Persia are now believed by historians to have been Zoroastrians. Among these are Cyrus the Great. Remember, King Cyrus was the one who permitted the Jews to return from Babylonian captivity. He had taken over Babylon and they were now in his territory. He permitted them to return back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Darius I is also a king of the Persians who is mentioned in the Bible, and he too was one who was favorable to the Jews in their effort at rebuilding the temple. And then there was King Xerxes, called in the Bible Ahasuerus. He was the husband of Queen Esther. Now it is believed by historians that Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes were all Zoroastrians. And that's very interesting, I think, and we shall see more about that as we go on. Today there are not many Zoroastrians left. It is estimated there are probably only 100,000 of them, and that they're located mainly in India, in Pakistan, and in Iran, with just a scattering of them in other nations of the world. They today are not evangelistic. They are not mission-minded, as we would say. They have no desire to make converts from others, and so their number obviously is diminishing. Perhaps eventually they will die out. They certainly will die out if they do not make a change and change their attitude toward making converts. But even though their number is quite small, they have made a very great impact upon the history of the world. Zoroastrianism is of special interest, I think, to those of us who are Christians because originally Zoroastrianism taught belief in a God who was good, but also in one who was evil. It taught belief in a day of judgment, and it also taught belief in heaven and in hell. Now we want especially to notice as we go on that Zoroastrianism stressed the great battle, the eternal battle that is going on between good and evil. Today, some of the liberal scholars, that is, scholars who do not believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, and they really may not even believe in God at all in any sense, and so they do all they can to destroy our faith in God and in the Bible. These liberal scholars believe that during the Babylonian captivity, much of the Bible had not yet been written. And because of this, the Jews learned about God and the devil and angels, and they learned about heaven and hell and judgment from the Zoroastrians. And so that entered into their religion and became a part of the Old Testament. Now, friends, that is the theory of the liberal scholars. But that theory certainly is not true. It is an unproven, modernistic assumption that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the many other parts of the Old Testament had not yet been written. In fact, by the time of the Babylonian captivity, most of the Old Testament had been written. All the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, those books were not yet written, but all the rest of the New Testament already was in use by the Jews. The truth of the matter, if it be known, is simply this: the Zoroastrians borrowed many of their ideas either from the Old Testament or what they had learned from contact with Jews through the ages, and perhaps there was still even the knowledge among them and other peoples of the East of the true God and of the true religion that had been handed down from the days of the flood. Let's look very briefly now at a history of Zoroastrianism. A history of Zoroastrianism. The founder of this religion, Zoroaster, was probably born about 650 to 600 BC. We cannot be quite sure of the date. There are a very few scholars who say that he lived much, much earlier, perhaps as early as 1700 BC. But there's really no evidence for that. Very likely he lived or was born somewhere between about 650 and 600 BC. Now that would be during the days of the prophet Jeremiah of the Old Testament. Much of what we know about Zoroaster comes from sources that were made long after his time on this earth. There's a great mixture of legend and myth in the records that have come down to us, and it's very hard to separate these from the actual historical facts. We do know that Zoroaster's name in Persian was Zarathustra, and it was changed when the Greeks translated it into their language. Zarathustra came out as Zoroaster, and we today generally know him by the Greek form of his name. Zoroaster grew up in a pagan environment where many different gods were worshipped. Not only this, but the people were very superstitious, and they perhaps believed in certain concepts of animism, that is, that there were spirits in trees and rivers and mountains and so on. And so it was a very superstitious and ignorant time. But in spite of that, Zoroaster himself had an inquiring mind, and he did not accept what he had been taught in his religion. He wanted to discover the truth for himself. His father was a camel driver, and so he was brought up as a poor man, but in spite of this, he had opportunity to get a good education, and later, if the traditions that have come down be correct, he was also trained in medicine. He was a man who was known, it is said, for his great kindness and his compassion. He was especially kind toward the elderly, and this was deeply appreciated by those who followed him. He was deeply interested in religion, and he pondered over the great questions of life. Who is man? Where did he come from? What is he doing here? Where is he going? Does man survive death? And what about the gods? Are there many gods? Is there just one God? And so these questions deeply troubled the young man, Zoroaster, and he began searching for the answer to them. He could not find the answers that he sought, answers that satisfied him in the pagan religions round about him, and so he decided that he would leave home and wander around seeking the answers to these great questions. Well, he traveled for about 10 years, thinking and meditating and searching and trying to learn the answers to the important questions of life. Finally, he claimed that he had a revelation from the one true God, and God answered his questions from him. Now it's interesting, and you perhaps will recall this, that nearly every one of these religions that we've studied have a founder who claims that he had a special interview with God, that God took him up to heaven and talked with him and gave him information and told him that he was the greatest man on earth and that he should go back to the earth and preach this new knowledge. We saw that, didn't we, in Mohammed? We see this here in Zoroaster, and we're also going to see it later when we study Jainism and Sikhism. But that was what he said he was told. He said an angel came to him who was 10 times the height of a man. And the angel told him his name was, translated from the Persian, Good Thought. Now whether it was a being or merely an idea, we're not quite sure, but this angel called Good Thought appeared to him and summoned him to come with him up to heaven. In heaven he was brought into the presence of the one true God, he said, the Supreme Being who created the world. And this God identified himself as Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda, which means wise Lord. And so Ahura Mazda, and that means wise Lord, is the God, the Supreme God of the Zoroastrians. This God instructed Zoroaster in the true religion and then sent him back to the earth to preach this faith. Zoroaster began to preach, and like many other great religious leaders, at first his efforts were met with very little success. People would not listen to him. Very few converts were made after several years of very hard work. But eventually Zoroaster was able to convince an Aryan prince by the name of Vishtaspa, that the religion that he was teaching was the one true religion. And so Vishtaspa became a convert, and since he was a prince and a man of great wealth and power, therefore he was able to influence many others to become followers of Zoroaster. And so the new religion began to grow and eventually developed into a world religion, the major religion of the Persian Empire. Well, Zoroaster continued to preach for the rest of his life. When he was about 77 years of age, it is said that he was officiating at a fire altar. Fire came to symbolize Ahura Mazda, and so fire, the worship of fire, entered into the religion of Zoroastrianism. But Zoroaster was officiating at the fire altar when an enemy came and killed him. Now let's notice the doctrines of Zoroastrianism. The doctrines of Zoroastrianism. Originally, Zoroastrianism was much closer to the Bible than many of the other religions that we've studied, particularly those of India and China. This was probably because of the influence of the Old Testament and because of the influence of the Jews that had been felt by Zoroaster. Many years later, far after the time of Zoroaster himself, Zoroastrianism degenerated into a polytheistic, fire-worshipping religion. It was designed originally to bring people back to Ahura Mazda, who was declared to be the Supreme Being who created the heavens and the earth. But later the old belief in many gods was added to it, and Ahura Mazda was just regarded as still the number one God, but not the only God. The basic idea of the original faith was that there is one supreme God called Ahura Mazda. One supreme God called Ahura Mazda. He was believed to be infinite in wisdom and goodness. He created the world and all in it, and He is the judge of man. He will judge man upon the basis of his deeds on this earth. The opening lines of the Zend-Avesta, which is the sacred book of Zoroastrianism, the opening lines of it says this: Ahura Mazda, the Creator, radiant, glorious, greatest and best, most beautiful, most firm, wisest, most perfect, and bounteous Spirit. And so that's how Ahura Mazda was originally regarded. But a second major idea of the original faith of Zoroastrianism was that in addition to Ahura Mazda, who was a good God, the Creator, and in that sense the Supreme Being, there was an opposing evil being who was called Angra Mainyu. There was an opposing evil being who was called Angra Mainyu. Angra Mainyu was just the very opposite of Ahura Mazda in every way. His aim was to lead men astray and eventually cause them to be destroyed. Now, sometimes later a tradition arose that said Angra Mainyu was the twin brother of Ahura Mazda, and Ahura Mazda chose to do that which was good and right, but his brother Angra Mainyu chose to do that which was evil. And so one became a good god and the other became an evil god. Now, if that be the case, then certainly Zoroastrianism cannot be referred to, even in its early stages, as monotheism, that is, a belief in just one God, because as a matter of fact they had a belief in two gods. Ahura Mazda was believed to have the same power as Angra Mainyu. The two were equal in power. But Angra Mainyu was also said to be eternal, as was Ahura Mazda, the good God. Early Zoroastrianism believed also in a judgment and taught that a judgment takes place soon after man's death. In other words, it would agree with the biblical teaching that it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. The judgment was the next major event following one's death. But it's interesting the way the judgment was presented. It was said that when man died and came to the judgment consisted not in appearing before a judge as in a court of law, but rather the judge, Ahura Mazda, judged man by a very unique way. There was a bridge, just really not much more than a tightrope, that was stretched between two very high mountain peaks. And so when one was brought to judgment, he had to walk that tightrope. Now far, far below were the fires of hell. But on the other side, when one had crossed over, there was the gates of paradise. And so if one were righteous and he came to that tightrope, he could very easily cross over and enter into paradise on the other side. But on the other hand, if one were evil, he would have great difficulty and eventually would slip and fall far below to his destruction in the fires of hell. Well, that was the original idea of judgment and belief in heaven and hell in early Zoroastrianism, but many hundreds of years later, as the belief in many gods was added to the original religion, then the idea of judgment was changed in order to accommodate the belief in many different gods. Let us now look at the sacred writings of Zoroastrianism. The sacred writings of Zoroastrianism. Scholars believe that originally there was a large body of Zoroastrian sacred literature, but most of it has perished, and so very little of it remains. But today Zoroastrians do have a sacred book, And this sacred book is called the Zend Avesta. The Zend Avesta. And it actually is a book that is in two parts. The first part of it is believed to be an inspired book which came from Ahura Mazda, and the second part is simply a commentary on that book. The Avesta is a sacred book. The Avesta is a sacred book, part of which goes back to the time of Zoroaster. It is not a large book. It is only about 1/10 the size of our Bibles. But the Zend is a very ancient commentary that was written on the Avesta. And so the Zend is an ancient commentary on the Avesta, but the two are put together, are called the Zend Avesta, and form the sacred book of Zoroastrians today. Now in the Avesta itself, there were three separate parts. There were three separate parts in the Avesta. The first part was called the Yasna. The Yasna. The Yasna was a group of hymns, or rather contained a group of hymns, that were called the Gathos, which were probably written by Zoroaster himself. Then the second part of the of the Avesta is called the Yasht. That's Y-A-S-H-T-S, the Yasht. It is believed to have been written much, much later, and it contains hymns to various gods. And so it could have been written hundreds of years later when Zoroastrians began to believe once again in polytheism. The last section of the Avesta is called the Vendidad. The Vendidad. I guess it's Vendidad. This book was written much, much later even than the Yasht, and it contains laws against demons, magic spells and incantations, and things of a very superstitious nature. And of course it belonged to a later period of Zoroastrianism when the religion had degenerated and gone back to very much like the earlier Persian religion. Well, hundreds of years after Zoroaster's death, the faith that he had established to emphasize belief in Ahura Mazda as the supreme being and the creator of the universe had been perverted into polytheism. Many of the ancient gods, as we've said, were added, but Ahura Mazda was still considered to be the supreme god. Fire worship was brought in even in the days of Zoroaster. In his days, fire was simply regarded as a symbol of Ahura Mazda, but it played a very large part in their worship. Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu were said to be twins who sprang from a unitary world principle called Zurvan. And there is discussion about the meaning of Zurvan. Some say that it means boundless time. Others say that it means boundless space. Some say that it means a combination of space and time, but we're not going to worry ourselves about that. Ahura Mazda, in later Zoroastrian history, came to be known as Ohrmazd. Ohrmazd, that's O-H-R-M-A-Z-D, Ohrmazd. And Angra Mainyu, the evil being, came to be called Ahriman, or the devil. Ahriman, A-H-R-I-M-A-N, or the devil. The ancient priests of the Zoroastrians were called Magi. Now the word Magi is the word that is translated for kings that we read about in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke when it speaks of the birth of Jesus, particularly in Matthew when it speaks of the wise men who came from the east having seen the star and they came to find the baby Jesus. They were called the Magi. Well, the word Magi was used to describe the ancient Zoroastrian priest. We get our word magic from that, and that probably tells us something about their religion and that with which they were involved. Although Christianity and Zoroastrianism have some similarities, there are many, many differences. And so we want to contrast Christianity and Zoroastrianism. Christianity and Zoroastrianism. Now, among these many differences between the two, in the Bible we find that the God of the Bible is all-powerful. But in Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda is only equal in strength to Angra Mainyu, the evil being. And so Ahura Mazda really is not all-powerful, as is the God of the Bible. Christianity has but one true God, but in Zoroastrianism there is dualism. That is, there are actually two gods of equal power. There is Angra Mainyu, the good God, and there is his twin brother, Ahura Mazda, the good God, and his twin brother, Angra Mainyu, who is evil. Another difference between Christianity and Zoroastrianism is that there is no answer to the problem of sin in Zoroastrianism. And you know, that's true of many of these religions. You'll notice as we study them that many of them do not really have an understanding of sin or an explanation for it, and yet sin is man's greatest problem. But there is none of this in Zoroastrianism. Not only is there not an understanding of sin, there is no offering for sin. But of course in Christianity we understand that sin is a transgression of God's law which separates us from fellowship with God, and if not atoned for, will separate us from God throughout all eternity. In Christianity, we not only have an understanding of sin, but we have a sin offering in the person of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, "Him who knew no sin, He made to be sin on our behalf, that we might be made the righteousness of God in Him." I'm quoting from the American Standard Version. Modernists, those liberal scholars who do not believe in God and in the inspiration of the Bible, modernists teach that the idea of Satan was taken from Angra Mainyu of the Zoroastrians. But Satan, as he's presented in the Bible, is not like Angra Mainyu, who was equal in power to Ahura Mazda. Satan is certainly not taught to be equal with power with God the Father. And certainly the idea of Satan was not borrowed from the Zoroastrians, because you see, the nation of Israel had believed in Satan from the very beginning of time. Well, friends, if you open your Bible and start reading in Genesis, it isn't long before you come to Genesis chapter 3. And in Genesis chapter 3, you read of the fall of man. And who brought that about? Why, it was Satan. Satan came into the garden in the guise of a serpent, but it was Satan nevertheless. And so Satan is taught in the very beginning of the Bible and was believed in by the Jews throughout their history. The book of Job is one of the most ancient books of the Bible. It is believed that the events recorded in Job certainly occurred early in the patriarchal age. It may be that Job was a contemporary, that is, lived at the same time as Abraham. Is Satan ever mentioned in the book of Job? Indeed, he is. In the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6 and following, we read of a time when the sons of God came to present themselves before God, and among them Satan came. And it was then that God pointed out to Satan his servant Job, who was just and righteous in serving him. And Satan began to mock. And as a result of that, Satan was given permission to tempt Job. And in chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, we read further about Satan and his temptation of Job. And so, certainly the belief of the Jews in Satan not only went back throughout the entire Mosaic age, but it went back into the patriarchal age as well, and to the very beginning of the Bible. Therefore, the Jews did not borrow their idea of Satan from the Zoroastrians. It's probably more likely the other way around. The Zoroastrians borrowed their idea of Satan from the Bible and from their contact with the Jews. Modernists teach that the idea of judgment, heaven, and hell were learned from the Zoroastrians. Modernists teach that the idea of judgment, heaven, and hell were learned from the Zoroastrians. Now, friends, the Old Testament teaching is not as fully revealed as is the New Testament. The revelation of God was a progressive revelation. God was gradually unfolding His will to mankind. Brother Alexander Campbell referred to the patriarchal age as the starlight dispensation. He referred to the Mosaic age as the moonlight dispensation, and he referred to the Christian age as the sunlight dispensation. In other words, just as starlight is not as bright as moonlight, and moonlight is not as bright as sunlight, so it was with God's revelation. God was gradually unfolding His will to bring the Savior into the world, to redeem man from his sins, and so it is in the fullness of God's revelation in the Christian age that we understand many things. But even though the Old Testament revelation was not as complete as the New, yet God as judge is clearly taught in the Old Testament. It wasn't something learned from the Zoroastrians. In Genesis 18, verse 25, you remember that Abraham is speaking to God when God reveals to him that He's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham begins to bargain with God, and he says, "Surely the judge of all the earth will do right." What is he saying about God? He's the judge of all the earth. And so he believed in God as judge. In Psalm chapter 1, we read in verse 5, "Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous." And then over in Psalm, in chapter 9 of Psalm, or the 9th Psalm, in verses 7 and 8, we have these words, "But the Lord shall endure forever. He hath prepared His throne for judgment, and He shall judge the world in righteousness. He shall minister judgment to the people in uprightness." We could refer to many other passages in the Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 33 and verse 22 says, "For God is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, He will save us." You see, throughout the Old Testament, God is pictured as judge, and the judgment is mentioned. Again, heaven is set forth in the Old Testament as the dwelling place of God. Heaven is set forth in the Old Testament as the dwelling place of God. There are many references to heaven in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 14, heaven is spoken of as God's resting place, as is 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 27. And the psalmist said in Psalm 73:25, in speaking to God, "Whom have I in heaven but Thee?" Whom have I in heaven but Thee? And so heaven was not an idea borrowed from the Zoroastrians. The Jews, God's chosen people, have believed it all along. What about hell? Was hell borrowed from the Zoroastrians? No, indeed. It is taught throughout the Old Testament as well. If you have your Bible, please turn with me back to the book of Deuteronomy, one of the earliest books of the Old Testament. We want to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32 and look at verse 22. Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 22. And here's what we read. "For a fire is kindled in mine anger, and shall burn unto the lowest hell, and shall consume the earth with her increase, and set on fire the foundations of the mountains." And on through the Old Testament we find many references to hell. Proverbs chapter 7, verse 27, the wise man has been warning of the danger of going into the harlot's house, and it said there that her house is the way to hell. Now, friends, listen to this. Competent, conservative Bible scholarship dates the writing of the Pentateuch, that's Genesis through Deuteronomy, Job, 1 Kings, Isaiah, Psalms, and Proverbs, all these references that speak of judgment and heaven and hell, these books are dated long before Zoroaster was even born. And therefore, they could not have borrowed from Zoroastrianism, but if there's any borrowing that was going on, the borrowing had to be on the part of Zoroaster. Well, Zoroastrianism in its original form has about as much in common with Christianity and Judaism as Islam does. Just as Islam borrowed heavily from Judaism and Christianity, so it seems Zoroastrianism has done the same. There are some similarities, but they can be explained upon two grounds. Number one, in the patriarchal age, all men knew God and had some concept of God following the flood, and some of this truth would have remained in the world. Not all would have been lost. And number two, the Jews in their captivities and other associations with other nations influenced many with the idea of one God who created all things. Now, as we conclude our lesson today, let's briefly review the important facts that we have learned about Zoroastrianism. First of all, Zoroastrianism was once a major world religion. This was in the days of the ancient Persian Empire. King Cyrus, Darius I, and Xerxes were all Zoroastrians. But today, only about 100,000 Zoroastrians remain in the world. They live mostly in India, Iran, and Pakistan, and here, particularly in India, they are referred to as Parsis. Parsis. Zoroastrianism originally taught that there was a supreme being who was creator, there was a judgment, heaven, hell, and an evil being, the devil, which was probably, these ideas probably borrowed from Judaism when the Jews were in Babylonian captivity. Zoroaster, whose real name in Persian was Zarathustra, Zarathustra was born in Persia somewhere between 650 and 600 BC. He lived during the time of the prophet Jeremiah, who lived during the days of the beginning of Babylonian captivity. Ahura Mazda, which means wise Lord, was the supreme being, and he is the one who commissioned Zoroaster to preach. Zoroaster did not have much success until he converted a prince by the name of Vishtaspa, and then the religion began to grow. There's an opposing evil being in Zoroastrianism who is called Angra Mainyu, and he is the counterpart of the devil. Their sacred book is the Zend Avesta. The Avesta is the inspired book, and the Zend is a commentary on it. Well, in our next lesson, we're going to be going back to India and studying a religion of India, one of the offspring of Hinduism, and this is the religion called Jainism. We invite you to be back with us for that very interesting study. We thank you for your attention.
This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.